Hasn't this been a great morning? The choir, all your smiling faces, watching Gara doing his clippity-clop on the drums there. Can't wait until you get going up and down. And Tim, we appreciate you and all that you do. And to me, it's been an interesting weekend. If you were at the celebration for Miss Evelyn yesterday, what a testimony about walking with God. And as your daughter-in-law shared, I think as Tim mentioned, I got on the phone with my wife when I was driving home, and I said, it was the most beautiful statement that a daughter-in-law could make about her mother-in-law. And so often that's not true. There's animosity and struggles, but you just have to been praying with Miss Evelyn on Wednesday nights to know that she would just love her daughter-in-laws. And what a special time to celebrate the life of someone who truly loved God. It's such a privilege that God brings us in contact with beautiful souls like that during our lifetime, and we get to watch their testimony. So if you were not there yesterday, you missed a wonderful celebration. Well, to change notes on you here some, I was going to ask you the question, have you ever had one of those weeks where it seems like everything goes wrong, but I know what your answer is? What do you mean weeks? Months on there? Oh, and before I sidetrack myself too much, my wife listens to the services. Now, if you know someone who can't come or is with the struggle with COVID or different things, the crew is so wonderful that usually within an hour the message is online. And so she listens every week, and so if you were here last week, I think it was the week before, as I was leaving out the door, she stopped me and she said, Norman, just make sure I have one of those lids that you have to open on your coffee. So I was looking for it this time. So, but with that, there's some of these times where we have bad weeks. Some of those times when the difficulty hits, sometimes it's because of our own fault, isn't it? We made some bad decisions and life turned messy. Other times, it's just you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and things just go haywire on us. And with that, often we face very difficult times that are completely out of our control. Sometimes we bring it ourselves, sometimes we don't, but a lot of times we face these things that seem totally out of control. And again, we may be at the wrong place, wrong time. Other times it may be someone's deliberately giving you a difficult time, that you're having one of those weeks or one of those months, or you're facing issues, and it may not be anything to do with you, but your coworker or neighbor or family member or something comes at you, and someone's intentionally giving you a difficult time. I was thinking through as we're going to start a new series today, but sometimes we find ourselves kind of in a mess, but I thought, the Christian life, to me, I wrote it can be full, can be satisfying, can truly be a blessed life, but it is very unusual. It's been one of those days for me too. Let me read that again. The Christian life can be full, satisfying, truly blessed, but it is usually not easy. The Christian life can be a blessed life. God gives us a blessed life. It can be satisfying. It can be a wonderful life. But the Christian life often is not an easy life. Would you agree with me on that? That we live in a very troubled world at times, and walking through and facing the things we face, we find ourselves facing challenges. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus makes a statement, or I guess it was John chapter 16. So I didn't have enough of that coffee today. He makes a statement, says, in this world you will face tribulation. But be of good cheer, for I've overcome this world. And so we do face kind of difficult things hitting us all the times that challenge us, and the issues that challenge us in trials of life. And so what we're going to look at is often you can't control the things that come around you sometimes. Sometimes we make mistakes, but often we can't control the circumstances around us. Maybe it's the economy or job things or health issues, unexpected. My coworker next to me, his wife has just been diagnosed with cancer and all kinds of stuff they're looking at. There's circumstances come around us. We cannot control everything that comes in our way, can we? And sometimes it's such a surprise when it hits us. We use the term blindsided when it hits us. We may not have any control over those things that come at us or circumstances, but we can control the way we respond to them. I don't know what this week is going to face. I don't know what this month I'm going to face. I don't know what's going to happen in my family. I don't know what will happen even in our country as we're seeking after the Lord, and you look at all the kind of mess that goes around us. I can't control those circumstances around me, but I do have a choice in how I respond to those things that happen around me. And so while we're going to look at the book of James, because the book of James has some really sound advice for how to deal with practical issues in life. And we're going to begin a study. We finished the Sermon on the Mount, and I got looking at what should we study next. And one of the practical reasons I kind of pick a series and go through so that Tim knows what we're going through, to line up music on there. But I started thinking about, have you turned the news on lately, or have you listened around what's going on in our country lately? Let's put politics aside or opinions on there, but we're in a mess, aren't we? And I don't know about you, I don't watch the news as much as I used to. I don't watch it much at all these days because every time I flip through the channels, it's just a bunch of talking heads telling me the same thing over and over. We just get it 24 hours a day, don't we? And everybody's got their opinion and everything seems to disagree with each other, but the world is constantly offering us advice and wisdom. But what do we know about the world's wisdom? There's a reason the Bible calls the world's wisdom foolishness. You don't have to look very long to realize that, is there? But the thing is, we are being bombarded with haywire thinking and haywire wisdom all around us, but we still have to live our lives in this real world, don't we? We're here today worshiping together and having a wonderful time listening to the music and fellowshipping with each other. Look forward to next week's. We're inviting people into small groups. And we do that, but eventually we have to get out there in this world that is really crazy. And if you think about it, it doesn't matter where you come down on an issue, you've got crazy thinking on this side and everything in between, don't you? And one of the things we're lacking in our day is some good biblical common sense. And it's amazing when you ask somebody and you get a response, or someone's reasoning or they're arguing, you have two people totally disagreeing with each other, and you look at neither side makes any sense. And the book of James gives sound advice of godly biblical advice, sound advice on how do you face the world that we're looking at. How do you face the issues that we deal with, the circumstances you can't control? The book of James offers sound advice on dealing with practical issues of life, such as facing unexpected trials and difficulties. When we look at the book of James, James is very different. I don't know if you've read the book of James or studied it. We're about to. But James looks different than any other book in our New Testament. You see our Gospels, we see our general epistles, we see our epistles of Paul, we see our book of Revelation. James stands out radically different than any other book in our New Testament, and because James is regarded as New Testament wisdom literature. And so if you're looking at something to compare, maybe to the book of James, you would look in our Old Testament, the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes. But I thought it's helpful because what the book of James does, it's very practical wisdom that challenges us to make sure that our theology, what we say we believe, is what we actually practice when we get out in the real world. And it's pretty blunt, but on the other hand, it says, this is what you say you believe. Now when you face all this stuff in the world, let's help you. If you say you believe this and you've hit these circumstances, now let's help you live it out in the real world. And it seems like in our day we have all this haywire thinking out there. We have all this haywire advice, but we're getting bombarded with trials and struggles and issues of life. It seems to me that it would be a good time to stop in the middle where we are in our country and say, we need some good biblical, practical wisdom for life. And that's what the book of James does. It helps us connect what we say we believe to our real life. Now, we know if we're honest, how many of us have ever said we believe something and then we turn around and practice something different? None of us have ever done that, have we? And James is going to help us say, this is what you say you believe, and what you believe is good. But now let's take it and make it practical and say, if you really believe this, let's see what a difference this makes when you walk in the everyday life. He starts off his book by dealing with very common issues for the Christian. As a Christian, he's going to ask her at the very beginning of his book, how do you act when life throws you a curveball? Or in other words, when we face trials and difficulties. So if you'll turn with me to James chapter 1, we're going to begin our study on this wonderful and very practical book. So James chapter 1, let me begin reading from verse 2. I'll begin reading at verse 1. So it's James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. I won't interrupt myself too many times here. When he's talking about his 12 tribes, he's talking about James and writing to the people of God. Because some of the 12 tribes, you remember that's a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel, and they've been scattered everywhere. And so in the middle of this crazy world, they're in a Greco-Roman world, in the middle of all they're facing, he says, I'm writing those 12 tribes in the dispersion, all these people who've been scattered all over the Roman Empire. And he starts off with this. He says, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, we could add in there, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness or patience. And let steadfastness or patience have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For the person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded and unstable in all of his ways. So as James begins his book, he's writing to these people who have been dispersed among the Roman Empire. There's pressure against Christians, there's persecution against Christians, there's all kinds of stuff. Some have been driven from their homes, some have been scattered all over the place. They're facing all kinds of trials, and he writes to them. You think about, if you were to talk to people who've been scattered everywhere, some of them had their lives taken, others have been their property taken, others have gone to another country where they don't know anything about that country, and there's all kinds of mess going on. What would you tell them to start with? Would we come around and say, I'm sorry, brother or sister, that you're going through this? What does he tell them when he starts off and he addresses? He says, count it all joy when you face various trials. How encouraging would that be in the middle of a crisis? Often this verse has been very misused and misquoted by people with rotten timing. When something goes totally haywire and they look at you and says, count it all joy. What are you talking about? I lost my house. Count it all joy. Did you hear the diagnosis the doctor just gave me? And so what is he saying here? Often this verse has been really misunderstood, but we put it in its context. He says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. So various trials is a reference to the things that happen from the outside. And with this, you catch this, count it all joy, my brothers, when you fall into various trials. This word here, fall, is like falling into things surrounding you. And so when he talks about fall, sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes it just comes around us. He says, count it all joy when you fall into these trials. That's the same word that Jesus uses in Luke chapter 10 when he talks about a certain traveler was going from Jerusalem to Jericho and he fell among robbers. And you're thinking, well, it was not his intention to fall among robbers, was it? He's making a simple business trip. He's going from one city to the other and fall among robbers. What does he mean by that? They were waiting around the corner and they jumped on him. So he says, count it all joy when you have these things come upon you. He says here, it's not, and again, it says, it's this understanding that something came upon you, it's an accident, it's something that you didn't bring maybe on your own circumstances, but you just fell into this and it ensnared you and it trapped you. He says, count it all joy when you find these various trials. He doesn't say what the trials are. And the word that means various is actually, we can translate another word mean many-colored. So these trials, he doesn't describe the trials. He says, count it all joy when you fall into these things come upon you, these various trials, and he calls them many-colored. It means that there's all kinds of different trials. Every one of us, if we were to go through this room and say, what are you facing right now? How many of us would look at it and say, some of you are facing health issues? Some of you are worn out with your job. Some of you have had a diagnosis and go through and you're trying to make a decision what to do, and others have simply have some difficulty that you're facing in your family or your neighborhood. There may be all kinds. Some of you may be struggling internally. He says, when these trials come upon you, he says, there are many colors suggesting there are all kinds of trials. And I think that's important as we begin looking at this passage. When James says, count it all joy, you can't just say, well, my trial's excluded from there. He says, no, all of us will face struggles, won't we? And if I was to ask you to raise your hand, I think an overwhelming majority of us would raise our hand and say, we are facing various struggles right now, trials that are bombarding us in this world. He says, in this world, we face those trials, those tribulations. Well, he doesn't say the trials are all joy. Over the years, I've faced quite a few different trials. And he doesn't mean to count the trial as joy. He says, I don't know about you, but I don't enjoy trials. I don't look forward to trials, do you? He says, count it all joy when you face these multicolored trials. He says, I think over the years we've had health issues, and guess what? Health issues usually fall into financial issues, don't they? And some of you have had work issues on there. Some of you had relationship issues on there. And over the years, we've faced quite a bit. I've shared with some of you on those things. I can honestly say that I didn't count any of my trials as joyful. I didn't count any of those struggles as joyful. I didn't count when the doctor looked at me and says, I don't think you're going to live. And the next doctor says, I don't think you're going to walk. I was not happy about that. I don't think that's what Paul is talking about here. He doesn't say the trials are the joy. And I would say that most of us, when we look at the trials, we don't gain joy from the trials. But what do you think he means? He says, he doesn't urge the readers to count it all joy and look for, he says it's not that he's saying you count the trials as joyful. But what he does urge them to do is, in the middle of the trials, to recognize that it's not the trial or not the event that you bring the joy from. There's somewhere else where it says, count it all joy. In the middle of the trials, you can walk with God. Count it all joy. In the middle of the trials, your source of joy comes from a relationship with God. So he's urging the readers, he says, look at it from we make it kind of trivial, but look at it from the bright side. It's capable of being a way to turn this event for the highest good. The trial is not the joy, but is there a way to look at your trial from a bigger perspective? When you face the trial, is there a way to look at it, just count it all joy? Well, what do you mean, James? I'm not going to enjoy this. It's a difficult time. And he says, but you need to realize, don't look at the trial as a difficult thing, but look at this trial as an opportunity to rest in the Lord. Can you look at your trial from a different perspective? Can you look at it from God's perspective? And for James, he's looking at what the people are facing, and he's telling them, you're going to face these difficult times. You can count it as joy because your source of joy comes from God. The trial is not the joy. But walking with God through the trials where we get our joy. Some of your translations word this, count yourself supremely happy. As I read this, if you're facing a difficult trial today, and you look at Blackaby sitting up here and says, count yourself supremely grateful that you're facing that trial. That sounds really odd, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound odd? You're facing a difficult time. Count yourself joyful, supremely grateful that you're facing this trial. Even saying that, it sounds a little different, doesn't it? And some people can pass it off as some kind of trivial stuff. Well, that's just a religious crusade. Count it all joy when you face trials. I don't know, what I'm going through is very difficult. But when you look at the passage, it fits in line with our New Testament. When Jesus is saying, count it all joy when you face the difficulties, he's saying this in light of what we see throughout our whole New Testament. We just finished studying the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus makes a statement, remember, blessed are you when men revile you, when they persecute you. He says, you shall have all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. The book of Acts records the apostles were being beaten for their faith. They're actually being imprisoned and beaten for their faith. And afterwards it says in chapter 5, he says, they departed from the presence of the council from what had just happened to them, rejoicing that they were counted worthy of the dishonor for their name. Paul states this, he says, I'm filled with comfort. I'm exceedingly joyful in all the tribulations in 2 Corinthians chapter 7. In Romans 5, he says, we glory in tribulation. We can read in the books of Peter and the books of Hebrew that ordinary Christians were able to rejoice in times of tribulation. And we're going to be talking about wisdom, the world's wisdom versus God's wisdom. Our world would tell us that we're crazy when we hit difficult times to count it as joy. They say, you don't know what you're talking about. But the world's wisdom is foolishness compared to God's wisdom, isn't it? And God's wisdom over and over and over and over again says, in the middle of tribulation, in the middle of trials, in the middle of struggles, not only is there a teaching to count it as joy, to look at it very differently, but there's a testimony from our apostles in the book of Acts to Paul's writing, to Peter's writing, to the book of Hebrews. Over and over and over again, there's this consistent teaching to say, in the middle of trials, we're to count it as joy. Well, I told you at the beginning, James offers practical wisdom, and you wonder, how in the world can we consider this as joy? Again, James, it was a fellowship with God that was the source of joy, not looking at the trial. Well, James challenges the early church that walking through trials can produce positive things in the Christian life. So let me read verse 3 to you again. He says, for you know that the testing of your faith produces peace. Some of your translations may say patience or else steadfastness. Let me read it again. For you know that the testing of your faith produces patience or steadfastness. The troubles and the hardships in our lives give us the opportunity to prove our faith. He says, count it all joy when you face these things, when they fall upon you, because the testing of your faith. You realize that the testing of your faith produces this steadfastness and this patience. And often we don't recognize when you hit a trial or a struggle, what happens? We focus in on ourselves, don't we? We're trying to get out from underneath this trial. And he says, you realize that's the time where you get to find out who you really are. Some of you who've been around for a bit longer than others, you realize, you think back, and I was thinking, my wife and I have been married 28 years now. And we've had a wonderful marriage and a wonderful wife, and it's a great experience. But when I start looking at those 28 years, and I start looking at the times where we really grew, when was those times we really grew, if we're honest about it? Is when we faced the trials and the struggles together, wasn't it? And he says, you need to recognize that during the trials is a time of testing, to purging our faith. Is that a bad thing? We don't enjoy the trials. You don't ever enjoy the trials. You'd be weird if you enjoyed the trials. But look at what's come out of the trials. Think about the times that you've walked with God in the peace of God, and it taught you about yourself. It taught you about your faith, and it taught you about how to walk with Him. And as much as we don't like the testing and the trials, it shows us our strength and our resolve to walk with God. Now, that's not always the case, is it? Sometimes we can look at our trials and realize we did really bad. Sometimes we can hit the trial, and what can happen? We can get discouraged with God. We can hit the trial and we can walk away from God. We can get angry. We can get bitter. We can kind of walk away from those things. But again, it's a choice we make. He tells us to count it all joy, and he says, because when you hit those trials, and we will all be hitting those trials, he says, you have a choice in what you're going to do with them. He says you can count them as joy, as an opportunity to have your faith tested and walk with Him, or you can crumble in it, or you can get bitter in it. What is our world going to tell you? The wisdom of our world, when the difficult things hit, what do? What does the world tell us? Well, first we're supposed to blame our parents, aren't we? I wouldn't have this if I didn't have bad parents. Isn't that, I mean, we laugh about that, but that's true, isn't it? As soon as you hit a difficult time, what does the world tell you? Look for someone to blame. Isn't it? I mean, that's the general wisdom of our world. Look for someone else to blame for this. What's the next thing they tell you? Figure a way to get out of it at all cost. They'll walk alongside you and they'll put their arm around you and say, you have every right to be bitter and angry about all this trial you're facing. I would be too. And the world will come along us when these trials hit and will give us the world's best wisdom, which is foolishness. But it sounds really good, doesn't it, to our ears? Yeah, I may have done the wrong things that got me in this mess, but if I can blame it on someone else, I'm free on that, aren't I? Yeah, I hit this trial and things are really difficult over here, but But they told me it's okay to be angry about that. It's okay for me to blame others about that. It's okay for me to internalize it, to get this, just stop in my tracks and not produce anything out of it because after all, I'm being treated bad. Life is not fair for me. And the world will come around us and tell us those things. But what does James say? He gives us wisdom from God. He says, what do you do when you face those trials? Different than what the world does. He says, count it as joy. Not the trial, but the opportunity to have your faith tested, because it's going to tell you who you are. It's going to tell you who God is as you trust in him. And I think all of us have times where we could look back in our life and say, you know what, I remember when we got that diagnosis, or I remember when that crazy bill hit us, or I remember when that thing happened that just threw everything outside. I remember when the layoffs came and we realized, what are we going to do? We got to provide for the family, we got a mortgage, and we got a car payment, we got things. We try to wrestle through those things. And you can think back at the times where you said, you know, we just went to the Lord and we trusted. And what can you say? Usually when that happens, what do you normally say after that? And looking back on it, God took care of us. Looking back on it, we watch how God walked with us through that. You're looking back and you say, you know how we grew in our faith and our prayer life and our walk with God. There's other times where we look at the trial and say, you know what, we really blew it at that time. He says, count it all joy, because when you walk through those difficult times and you rest in him, it will grow your faith. Your true faith will be exposed, and you learn more about yourself and your God through the ordeal. But again, it's a choice. Are we going to follow the wisdom of the world and blame everybody else and get bitter about it and give excuses? Or are we going to follow the biblical wisdom of James, who says, you know what, in the middle of this, it may be awful, it may be difficult, but this is an opportunity to trust in God and know more about yourself and the one that you're serving. Well, verse 3 states that trials produce patience in our life. How many of us enjoy patience? How many of us would like to be patient? You know the awful truth of that, isn't it? That there's only one way to learn patience, isn't there? What's the easiest way to learn patience? And the only way, I think, to learn patience is by trials, isn't it? I don't think there's any other way to produce growing patience in our lives except through walking through difficult circumstances. Now, we won't make any comments on people's parenting, but if you've been to the store any time over the years, if you've been around a kid that immediately everything they want, they automatically get. Oh, I see shivers, don't we? What happens when they have to wait? I remember my dad looked at me when I was 16. He said, Norm, you want a car? And I said, yeah. And he said, get a job. A year later, I had a car. But he says the trials that you face, if you count them as an opportunity to rest and grow in the Lord, will produce patience. Or your translation may say long-suffering. Patience is a virtue mentioned in the New Testament a lot. Paul speaks of it, he says that we have a God of patience in Romans 15. He commends the Thessalonians for the practice of patience and faith in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. He charges Timothy to follow patience in 1 Timothy 6. The writer of Hebrews says this in chapter 12, run with patience the race that is before us. It's a word that means steadfastness, endurance, fortitude, and here we could translate it as staying power. So he says here, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds, of multicolored trials, for you know that the testing of your faith will produce steadfastness or staying power. The trials perfect our character, according to verse 4. He says, and let the steadfastness or the patience have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Trials perfect our character, that they would be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. But he says, let patience have its perfect work. That's a struggle, isn't it? And remember, James is offering practical wisdom. He says, let patience have its perfect work. What do you think that means? How many times do we short circuit the process? He says, the trial hits. It doesn't matter what it is. It's many-colored. It could be any kind of trial that hits us. And he says, look at it, count not the trial, not the mess, but the joy of knowing that you know the Lord Jesus Christ in you. He says, you have him in you. He says, let that trial, count the joy that you get to walk with him in the middle of it. He says, it's going to produce patience, but let it have its perfect work. In a practical way, James puts it this way. He says, don't bail out on the trial, let patience have its perfect work. Trust in God and walk through it. What happens, how many of you know as you go through, as you watch, and some of you are a bit older and you've taught people and you've walked with them, and some of you are teachers and coaches and other things, and you watch, when someone hits a tough time, what happens if they bail too soon? And they jump out of it. The lesson is never learned, is it? He says, let patience have its perfect work. When you hit the trial, what's the world tell you? Get out of it. Get out of it quick, don't you? What does James say? Stop and recognize this is an opportunity for me to see who my God is and walk with him, and let patience have its perfect work. How many of you have told someone younger, not to pick on our young people here, we've all been there. That's how we got older. But how many of us have bailed on the process and didn't learn the lesson? And someone older than us looked and said, if you just stuck with it for another little while, it would have all worked out well. Well, I can't stand my job and my boss and everything else that's going on. And say, if you just stick with it a bit longer. As a professor, I see people drop out of classes. I'm thinking, you may be struggling, but if you just stick with it, it's going to come around. You're going to understand. It's going to take you to a place that will ultimately get you this degree, that gets you this job, that has a really good career. But when you bail because it was a little tough, it's the tough things that are worth it, aren't they? It's walking through the trials to let patience have its perfect work. The patience or endurance produced by trials must be permitted to run its course, to have its full effect on our lives. There are times we don't let this happen because we get discouraged or impatient. I think about Abram when he was called in Genesis chapter 12. He was 75 years old. Later on in chapter 15, he's discouraged, and God comes to him and says, Abram, why are you discouraged? And he says, because you promised me a child, and I don't have one, and the one who's with me is not my child. He's Eliezer from Damascus. And I wonder, why did it take so long for him to give him that child? And I wonder if it took that patience to build his character to get him ready to be the dad he needed to be. He said, let patience have its perfect work. In the middle of the trial, the world will tell you, get out from underneath it. Find any way to bail on it. Blame anybody else you can. What does God say? He says, look at this as an opportunity to walk with him. You don't enjoy the trial. You don't enjoy the difficult time. None of us do that. We want to figure ways to solve those things out, but don't neglect the opportunity that as a Christian, when you're walking through difficulties, you have an opportunity to learn about yourself and your God. And if I ask you to give testimonies, many of you could say, we walked through that difficulty, but let me tell you about what we learned about God. And the standard thing when you ask the different trials I've shared with you, the health issues and stuff, would I ever want to go back to that time where I took that bad vaccination and I was crippled and years of working through and the pain and the wheelchair and all the stuff, and would I want to go back and do that ever again? No. If I had an opportunity to take that again, would I? No. But I don't. Would I trade what I learned for anything? No. I learned about my Lord. I learned about prayer. I learned about my Lord as my provider. I learned about how my Lord takes care of medical bills. I learned about how my Lord brings encouragement. I learned how my Lord takes two young couples in their first year of marriages and teaches them about being in a relationship that now we're at 28 years. The things that we learned that year, I would say, is what's kept us together for 28 years. He says, let patience have its perfect work in you. Now, when he says this in verse 4, he says, and let the patience or steadfastness have its full effect, its perfect work in you, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That's a really interesting verse that he says there. He says, you may be perfect and complete. Now, I don't want to burst anybody's bubbles, but none of us are going to be perfect, are we? We just have to ask your spouse and she'll tell us or he'll tell us. In the Hebrew and the Greek, not the language, but in the culture, in that day, When we use the word perfect in our day, we think of no mistakes. We think of perfection as far as there's no error, nothing in there. In the biblical day, when they say the word perfect, they mean you're created exactly who God intended you to be. And so sometimes we take our thinking and say perfect means without mistake. That's not what it means here. It means created exactly who God intended you to be. Let patience have its perfect work in you, making you perfect, making you exactly who God intends you to be for His purposes. Think about in your own life some stuff that you've walked through and you were patient and you had God teach you and walk with you and teach you about prayer and His love and His provision, and you grew with Him. And then what did He do? He turned around and used that to glory Himself and His kingdom and to draw others to Himself and for you to bear witness of our God's goodness. So let patience have its perfect work in you so that you'll be created into exactly who God needs to have you to be so that He can use you for His kingdom. And I wonder how many of us short-circuit that. We listen to the world, get out of this, blame someone else, do all this. Says, no, you're in a trial. Don't stay in there, but trust in God, rest in God, take your time honoring God, seeing how God's going to teach you, and let that patience, let Him build your character so you're steadfast, so that you're exactly who God needs you to be down the road when He chooses to use you to impact someone else's life. And I wonder how many times we short-circuit that. And He's saying, I know you're facing this. It fell on you. It's many-colored. There's all kinds of avenues with it. It's not pleasant. But growing is usually not pleasant, is it? It's the perfect word. It means growing onto maturity. Not making us sinless in the verse, but it means that being made perfect is to be made into or used exactly how God intended for you. It means made mature or fully grown. I don't know any other way we grow in the Christian life. When things are really going good is when we tend to walk away a lot of times, isn't it? How are you going to know your faith unless you're tested? How are you going to know that He answers prayer unless you have a burden in front of you that you got to go pray for? How do you know that He provides unless you have a need that needs providing for? How do you know that He's a God that brings a peace that surpasses all understanding until you're in a situation where you need a peace that surpasses all understanding? All the things that we see about God, how do we know those things? We know them by experience. He tells us in His Word, and then we live out this Word, and we trust in it, and we put it into our lives. But as we go through these trials in life, that is how we grow. Let it make you perfect, lacking nothing. Well, James lets them know that they need to respond to adversity and trials, but he doesn't leave them there. He teaches them about the spiritual things that God provides as we face trials. And that's the wonderful thing about our Lord. He doesn't say, you're going to face these trials and I'm going to leave you hanging. He says, you're going to face these trials. Don't be discouraged by these trials, but use those times as a joy that you're going to know me better, and let me tell you what I'm going to provide for you. And James, here, verse 5, he says, and if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask with faith. And so let's deal with that a little bit here, because this is important when he says that it's going to produce patience, let it have its perfect work, but he says, you're not going through this on your own. The first resource God gives is His wisdom. And I know I've brought this up over the 8 months I've been with you since February, but this is one of the most astounding truths that I think are in the Scripture, and it's overwhelmed me over this years. I've been studying this. I've read this passage over and over and over and over and over again. He says, if you lack wisdom, how many of us in the middle of trials lack wisdom? How many of you says, this isn't just some accidental, this is a thing that says it fell on you. It's like burglars falling on you, robbers falling on you. It's many-colored. It's overwhelming at times. When you face those things, how many of us lack wisdom? I know I do. My first fear is, what is going on? He says, if you lack wisdom, what does he say? He says, if you are facing these troubles, he says, be of good cheer, be of joy, let it produce this thing, because I'm going to give you wisdom. If you lack wisdom, he says, let him ask God who gives generously and without reproach. What an amazing statement that he makes there. The only way you're going to understand your trials is by asking him for wisdom. I think that's somewhere how we get short-circuited at times. We hit the trial and then we try to figure it out on our own. We hit the difficult circumstance and we seek everywhere else for help. Like I shared with you the other day, the last person they usually came to is the pastor. They've been everywhere else. Their friends, their help, Oprah, all over the place. And next thing you know, when nothing else works, they knock on the pastor's door. It makes us feel real good. And then we just refer them back to James and say, if you're lacking wisdom, I can help you find the person who will give you the wisdom. He says, if you're lacking wisdom in the middle of the trial and you don't understand what to do, and he says, count it all joy. My first thing when I read that as we're struggling, I said, God, how in the world am I going to count this joy? It's not fun. He says, let me give you my wisdom on it. Can he do that? Lord, I see no way out of this trial that I'm facing. He says, I know you don't. But you don't realize I saw your yesterday, I see your today, I see your tomorrow. He says, go back and read this psalm called Psalms 139, and I tell you, I have every one of your days numbered before they came about yet. Let me tell you, I know exactly what you're going to be facing. And I've already provided everything in place to help you through it. Just ask. But a lot of times we hit the trial and we struggle because we don't ask for his wisdom. And if we don't ask for his wisdom, what are we functioning on? The world's wisdom. And what do we know about the world's wisdom? It's foolishness. It will never help you understand anything from God's perspective. And if you don't have God's perspective, where are you going to be in the middle of that trial? You're going to struggle. So he says, if anyone lacks wisdom, ask. Now, did you catch what he says about the ask? I know I've brought this up a bunch over the times I've been with you, but it's something that grips me over and over again. Let him ask God who gives generously. How does God give? Do you remember a little story in the Gospels where it talks about how God gives? And he takes his container and he pours it into the container. What does he do when it starts filling up? He shakes it. And then what does he do? He pours more in, and then he shakes it, and he presses it down. And he pours more in until what? It overflows. God gives generously. God gives overwhelmingly. God gives to the fullest. That's his nature. And he says, if you want wisdom in the middle of the difficult times, when you hit them, ask God who gives generously. But he makes another statement here that to me is one of the most incredible statements we have in our Bible. He says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God who gives generously to all. How many are included into all? Every single person who asks him, without reproach. He's not going to withhold it. He's not going to ask you what you're going to do with it. He's not going to put conditions on it. He's going to give it liberally, without reproach. In this passage, when God says, if you're in a trial and you count it as joy and you let this patience have its work and you're not having any clue how to do it, you ask him who gives generously for wisdom without reproach. He's not going to look at you and say, well, the last time I gave you wisdom, you didn't do well with it. I'm not giving you more. Without reproach means there's no strings attached. He gives the wisdom. And he overwhelms you with the wisdom. And he gives you more than you can contain on the wisdom. He says, if you lack wisdom, so how do you walk through these trials? He says, you need wisdom. You need his wisdom, his perspective. Simply ask him. Well, the next thing he tells us in this, he says, not only does he give wisdom, but he says the second resource he gives us is prayer. He says, if any one of you lacks wisdom, ask. Pray to him. Go to him. Ask, seek, and knock, and what will he do? So he says, if you're in the trials, he says, you're going to walk this way, but you got all the access to all the wisdom of God. You just simply have to ask and pray to him and do that. He will give generously without reproach on there. And then last he says it's through faith. Our prayers are effective when we ask in faith. He says, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For the person who must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's double-minded and unstable in all his ways, the one that asks without faith. He doesn't tell you how much faith to have. He says, have faith and trust in him that he will bring those things. But he says you need to ask in faith. Hebrews 11:6 says, but without faith it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. We need to have a confidence that what we read in here when he says, when you go through trials, the world will tell you, no, trials are awful, trials are a horrible thing. Trials are not fun. But what does our word say? Count it as joy. You're going to have an opportunity to be tested in your faith, to struggle through there. But in the middle of that, the trial's not fun, but walking with your God, finding the joy that comes with your God, understanding the truths of him and how he walks with you in this relationship of love. It says, and when you don't know how to do that because we won't, he'll say, just come and ask me. And I will give generously and without reproach to anybody who asks, but you got to believe in me. It says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have the faith of one of the greatest saints in the history of the world, does it? You just simply have to believe that what he said is true. And we have other passages that say where a man says, help my faith, but he says, I struggle. It says, I believe you, but I struggle with my unbelief. If you're struggling in there, it says you come to him and you ask in faith, and you're struggling in your faith and asking for wisdom to how to have faith. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but he says he'll give you wisdom. He won't hold you accountable as far as there's no reproach on it. He gives generously. Just got to believe in him. Come to him and ask him with the expectation that everything God said about himself is true. Well, James's wisdom is very different than the world's wisdom. And he starts out in a practical way, knowing every single person he's probably writing to at this time is facing some kind of trials. And he starts off his book by saying, don't look at it like the way the world looks at it. You will be facing trials this week. Some of you are facing immense trials right now. How should you look at those times? We don't go looking for trials. I'm going to see if I'm going to grow in my faith. I'm going to go find a difficult circumstance. You don't have to look for them, do you, in this world? They're all over the place. But if you're currently facing trials and tribulations, or if you're not, you will be. James starts off and says, don't approach it like the world does. They're going to blame everybody else. They're going to make excuses for it. They're going to tell you it's okay to be angry about it. They're going to tell you you should be this way and all kinds of excuses for it. What does James tell us? We are facing trials right now. God, I'm thankful you that I get to walk with you. I'm thankful that my joy, it comes from you as my source of life and goodness. Don't short circuit the process. Don't try to bail out of it, but ask God for his wisdom. God, what am I supposed to learn through this? Does that mean you stay in the trial longer? No, we want to get out of the trials, but while you're in there, ask God, what do I need to learn? Let patience, let steadfastness have its work in you. If you're facing difficult times, James would say, stop and ask God what you need to learn while you're going through the process. I think all of us have those times where we face a trial and we short-circuited it, we didn't get anything out of it. But I think many of us could share that when we walk through those trials, trusting in God, the things we learned about God, we wouldn't trade for anything, would we? The things we learned about his beauty and his love and his provision and his grace and his hope and his peace, we wouldn't trade anything for those, would we? And he says, when you let him do that and he teaches you, he'll make you perfect, which means exactly what you need to be for God to use you in this very troubled world. And we take that experience and we help others along with it. But James tells us you don't go through that alone. He says you're going to need his wisdom. The good news on there is that he gives it, doesn't he? You just got to ask. And he's going to give you overwhelming more wisdom than you could ever hold or contain, and it's going to overflow. And when he gives you that wisdom, he's going to look and say, you know what, I'm not holding any strings attached. I will give the wisdom. He says, just come and pray to me, but make sure when you do it, you believe that I can provide it. And then let him do his work. So we're going to start a new series on the book of James. I hope that you will enjoy going through and having James kind of line up our lives, what we say we believe, and how we function together. I think in our day, there's so much wisdom out there that makes no sense at all. And the world bombards us with so much stuff out there that I think it's important that we stop and say, what does the Bible have to say about God's wisdom? How do we practically live our lives in this crazy world according to His wisdom? And I think we're going to have fun going through this. And so I'm going to have a word of prayer with you, and then we're going to have a time of invitation if Tim wants to lead us. But I'd say today, if you're struggling and you've been overwhelmed with the circumstances around you, I'd invite you to come and just spend time at the front just asking God for wisdom and stay before Him long enough for Him to give you the wisdom you need. I'd also say that if you've been in the middle of the circumstances and you've been trying to bail out of there, I'd challenge you to go before God and say, God, before we get out of this circumstances, what do I need to learn? How do I need to have the steadfastness brought up in me to make me perfect so that you can use me? And let me just say for you who've walked through tribulations and you've walked out of it and you're on the other side looking back right now, when God let you have that patience and have His perfect work in you, it was so that He could use you to walk with others that are hitting struggles too. So wherever you are in the process, we go through this process of struggles and walking with it and getting out of it. But if you're at the other side of that and you have to say, well, Blackaby, everything's good right now, but we've walked through some stuff. We're part of a church family to walk with each other. And if you've walked through some struggles and you see one of our dear brothers and sisters in Christ here that are just hitting some stuff you walked through, not in an arrogant way or judgmental way, but in a way to walk through and say, let me tell you how God built that in our lives. Let us walk with you. Some of you have walked through all kinds of stuff over the years. Those aren't just for you, but they're for us as a church. And it may be someone you need to walk alongside and say, you know what, I know you're going through this. My wife and I, my husband and I, we went through some of those things 5, 10 years ago. Let me tell you what God taught us. Let me tell you about the goodness of our God. Let me tell you about the wisdom of our God. Let me tell you how He gives us wisdom generally. He gives it generously, and He gives it without reproach. So let me have a word of prayer with you. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. And Lord, at a time where it seemed like our world is in such a mess, you gave us some very practical wisdom in the book of James. So Lord, I pray that you would use this book to impact our lives, that you would encourage us as we face all the trials and struggles that we face out there in this world. Lord, I pray for anybody here today who's discouraged, Lord, that they would look to you and they would count the experience as joy because they get to walk with you and experience you. Lord, I pray for us as a church that we would let patience have its perfect work in us. Lord, as we wait on you, as we trust in you, as we grow in you, that you would make us into exactly who you want us to be for your purposes. Lord, I pray for all of us here today that for those that are in trials and struggling, Lord, and those that you've walked through the trials and struggling in the past, that you would link us together as a church to walk with each other and encourage each other. Lord, that we not only do we not face these trials on our own, but we face them walking with you and also our church family. Lord, I pray that we would become a place that is known for walking with each other, directing each other towards you. And Lord, that we be known for steadfast, patient trust in you. Where everything else seems to be clamoring around and falling apart, Lord, that we would be a people that are steadfast, trusting in you and walking with you and praising you. And I pray these things in your name. Amen.